the level of emission. So in some idea for countries like us, developing countries, the idea of catching up to the level of development of advanced economy tends to be difficult if we have the new, or we follow this new condition of immediately start to reduce emissions. It's something like the famous idea of kicking away the ladder. How can advanced economies internalize this historical responsibility for global environmental damage and help those developing countries to take a different, a new development path? How to avoid that developing countries perceive that climate compromise as a change of rule that jeopardize its path to development? And an additional question, this is more structural, but now you present a description of the crisis that was very damaging in the sense of we are going to an stagflation, maybe a global stagflation. So my additional question is how this crisis, macroeconomic crisis, could affect the compromise of fight against climate change.
Yeah, this is a great question. And there's a very basic, crucial idea, I think, which is the following. The good news is that the cost of zero carbon energy, especially wind, solar, hydro, geothermal, has really come down incredibly sharply. But it is very capital intensive technology. So the difference of powering electricity with wind and powering electricity with gas is that with wind, you pay up front. You have to finance the turbines and the transmission system. With gas, you pay along the way. Of course, you buy some turbines, but you pay for the gas along the way. And if you actually ask which is cheaper, to do it through wind and solar or to do it through gas, the answer is it depends. If the interest rate is very low, actually it's cheaper, even cheaper in any discounted sense, to do it through the zero carbon, because you take into account, you don't pay for all that fuel down the road, you only pay for the capital up front. And if the capital cost is essentially a very low interest rate times the cost of capital, what we call the levelized cost or the permanent cost of that energy is tiny. So suppose that Argentina could finance, build out an entire zero carbon grid at 2% interest rates, 50 years. You'd say, hell, that's great. Let's do it, because 2% on some billions would be a very low cost, and you don't pay for anything afterwards, just a little bit of operations and maintenance. The problem comes with high interest rates. If you try to finance a renewable energy system with high interest rates, you get crushed, because the capital costs are very large relative to a fossil fuel energy system. And with high interest rates, it's much more expensive, even on a levelized basis. So the real answer to the question, in my view, is long-term finance. Long-term finance that doesn't exist right now. To say to developing countries, build out your renewables, but go to the Eurobond market and pay 13% interest rates for it is insane. It's impossible. You could never make the energy transformation that way. So what we need is guaranteed, committed, long-term, by that I mean 40 years or longer, low interest rates to finance the energy transformation in the developing countries. Then it would be cheaper to do, actually. Cheaper in an absolute sense, also would save the climate. The rich countries don't do anything right now. They're just absolutely almost useless because they don't understand this basic issue. And they're uninterested in the situation of the developing countries except to tell them, you do it, but we don't have to pay for it. and they promised 100 billion of financing, which is far too small. And then they couldn't even come up with that, even when they were allowed to do the accounting. You know, if you're allowed to write your own report card and you still get D's, that's pretty pathetic. You know, if you're allowed to write your own report card, at least you should get B's and A's. But the rich countries, they define what they mean by climate finance, and then they can't even come up with a meager 100 billion a year, which in a $100 trillion world economy just is not much of a lift. So my strong recommendation is very serious development financing that taps the capital markets for the long term. I would like to see the Inter-American Development Bank and the Latin American Development Fund, the CAF, increase their funding for green energy by a factor 10 and go into the capital markets to do it and on lend at low interest rates. Don't push the government of Argentina to do it, because Argentina can't borrow anything right now, much less to finance capital intensive energy transformation. So that's my basic answer. The same situation is true in Africa. You know, Africa, the African Development Bank, to cover a continent that doesn't even have electricity, much less green electricity, has a total lending flow for 1.4 billion people of $12 billion a year. In other words, nothing. And this is taken as kind of normal by the rich world. Now, there's another issue that's quite important in this, and that is not this energy transformation, which I think can be debt financed as long as the debt is 40 years plus and at low interest rates, but the question of adaptation and losses and damages. Because why should developing countries that didn't contribute to this mess have to do the cleanup on their own expense? And yet we have hurricanes slamming the Caribbean islands, and then when they do, the United States says, oh, that's so sad, we'll send you $5 million. Or Pakistan, which had 1/3 of the country under floods and thousands of lives lost and tens of billions of dollars of damages, the United States, I think, gave $20 million afterwards in response. So this is the category called losses and damages, which is that when you're incurring costs from historical emissions, those who should pay for it are those who made the historical emissions. Somebody's got to tell the United States, you know, you did something like 20 to 25% of this whole mess. So you have to do something about it. But, you know, people don't like to talk about the U.S. government like that, so they leave it to me. But my voice isn't strong enough to do this. We need the world to say, come on, we need fairness, justice, a losses and damages financing system, and then we could actually have both justice and the funding for adaptation and for recovering from these terrible emergencies which are hitting all the time. But my main recommendation in general is the following. The world financial system is really a funny thing. We have $25 trillion of saving, and in the rich countries, the borrowing costs are 3%, even till today. But try borrowing at 3% in Argentina or in any other developing country. You can't even come within hundreds of basis points of that. So the system is intrinsically unfair, and it needs